MIT is meant to be a multi-stakeholder dialogue about issues that are very controversial in the field of internet governance. So, to what extent the experiences from internet governance can be translated into other fields is an open question, and a question we probably have to tackle together. So, what I'm going to do is first talk a bit about the background of the IGF, where it's coming from, then how it works, a bit of the experiences we've had with this, and some lessons that I learned and others probably too, about the pros and cons of such international processes. The Internet Governance Forum, where does it come from? It emerged from a UN World Summit on Information Society that started in 2002. The preparatory process started in 2002, and it ended with a second summit in 2005. Originally, it was meant, the whole UN summit was meant to channel investment from IT companies from the global north to the global south. That was sort of the optimistic idea in the early days of the dot-com bubble, when lots of big IT companies were founded and made a lot of money. But when the summit actually started, the dot-com bubble didn't exist anymore, and most companies were quite reluctant to invest in the global south. Whatever, the whole, I would say almost the whole summit was hijacked by an entirely different issue, and that was the question of who should govern the internet and how should it be governed. That was a discussion that had started many years earlier, but in very small circles of experts. This UN Summit on the Information Society was the first international, or better, intergovernmental arena where this was for the first time really discussed among governments, and to a degree that it also met headlines in international newspapers. So after 1 or 2 years, it seemed that the whole UN summit revolved around the question of who should govern the internet. And that basically meant, how can we snatch away the role of the US government in governing the internet infrastructure, mainly the domain name system, but also the address space. Governments couldn't agree on a solution to this question. They couldn't even agree on language to put in the final declaration. So what they ended up with in one of the last nights of negotiations was to proceduralize the question. Civil society, which had been actively involved in this summit, had suggested that years earlier that there was a forum lacking where questions that concerned the international infrastructure of the internet, where such questions could be addressed. So they had suggested earlier already to found a new forum, an open space where governments, private sector, civil society, international organizations could actually talk on eye level to each other about the future of the internet. So what the declaration then said is that the UN Secretary General should found such a forum, a new open space where everybody could come and discuss the question of who and how the internet should be governed. Now, what is quite interesting about the Internet Governance Forum is its mandate. People who are acquainted with international organizations are aware that those usually don't have any decision-making authority. There are only very few processes that can actually make binding rules for all governments. And the Internet Governance Forum is not different in this respect. But unlike other international organizations, it cannot even sort of issue recommendation. Its whole mandate is about facilitating discourse. This has something to do clearly with its composition. Unlike intergovernmental organizations, the forum, the Internet Governance Forum, is open for everyone, so everybody can participate in its meetings and speak up. And second, it's not only governments, it's really also private sector and lots of civil society people. Almost half of the attendees come from a civil society and academic background. And that is one of the reasons why sort of the authority of the Internet Governance Forum is quite minimal. We have an open space, but this open space isn't really an agency that can sort of do more than bring issues up and discuss them. In the beginning, I thought, and lots of other people also thought, that this was actually a blessing. Who had attended UN summits knew that everybody focused just on agreeing on language. And this is quite a tiresome issue and doesn't translate very well to people not attending these meetings. Sort of the politicization of language is completely missed by those who just read the declaration. It's almost undecipherable and it gets totally lost. So I thought, and many other people thought, good that it cannot make decisions if we don't focus on this tiresome process, perhaps we can do other things. So in the beginning I thought, this is quite good that there's such an open mandate. Now, briefly about the structure of the IGF. It was convened by the UN Secretary General during the first 5 years. Now, it's not the UN Secretary General directly anymore, it's now CSTD, the UN Commission on Science and Technology for Development. Then there is a chair who does this as a sort of volunteer job. It's a $1 job. Then there is a secretariat consisting of one person, I'll say 1.5 persons, and some interns. And then there is what would usually be in intergovernmental organizations, the multi-stakeholder advisory group. This consists of about 50 people, half of them government, the other half a mixture of civil society people and private sector, and a few UN organizations. And then there are open consultations. They take place about 3 times a year and all revolve around the annual meeting of the IGF. So there's a lot of preparation and there is other afterwards some stock taking, sort of where people reflect on how was that meeting and how could we improve it in the following year. Interesting is that there is no funding at all for this whole process. The whole Internet Governance Forum depends on donations, and these donations usually come from the private sector. And this construction means that those who give funding also have some veto power. If they don't like something, they can threaten to withdraw their funding for the following year. So the Internet Governance Forum is a very fragile thing. It can, if it runs out of donations or support by major stakeholders, it just can't operate any longer. It's open, as I said, for everybody. There is no membership. This is, there are some models in the whole internet governance area. Lots of organizations are open and have very low entry barriers. Now, formal and process, as I said, there are annual meetings. They take place in different countries. Host countries apply for a meeting, and then if they are chosen, they have to fulfill certain standards. Particularly in the first 5 years, all who were involved in organizing these meetings thought of it as an experimental process. There are no multi-stakeholder forums of this size and the transnational scope like the IGF. So we all felt very privileged in trying out new things. And one of the major goals was to get involved as many people as possible, sort of to don't do panels and long presentations, but rather try to engage people in the room and make them talk to each other. Members of national parliaments, with civil society people, with, startup companies from the Middle East, that kind of thing. We managed that even with 300-400 people in the room. No panel, just a few aspects on the agenda we want to talk about, and then 2 people sort of moderating the discussion. We had transcripts so that everybody who couldn't attend in person could follow it remotely. These transcripts are still on the internet, so it's possible to read what had been discussed years before. It's still underutilized. We should actually analyze this material also to try to understand how discussions have evolved over the years. There's still a lot to do. But in any case, very open thing. Discussions were streamed and people could really interact directly with each other. What is also important is that the whole agenda of each annual meeting is organized by the attendees. People suggest workshops, and one of the selection criteria is that they are organized in a multi-stakeholder way. If possible, there should always be a representative from the government sector, from the private sector, from civil society, and perhaps the technical community on the panel if there are panels. Now it becomes a bit more conventional. There are much more panels now than there used to be in the 5 years. But this was one of the selection criteria, and everything on the agenda really comes from people who attend these meetings. There is no top-down process in sort of organizing the agenda. But I would say one of the successful parts of the IGF is that it has spread. It started with a sort of global internet governance forum, and soon after, actually starting with the UK, national and regional IGFs emerged. There are now, I think, in Africa, a North, a South, a West African one, East African one, a South African one, and we have the same for Europe. There's a European meeting, there are also lots of national IGFs. They're very different and not all as exciting as the global one was in the beginning, but still, it has spread. Now, one of the success criteria of the IGF is actually how did it deal with this controversial issue of internet governance, the question of how the internet should be governed. As I said earlier, it was one of the issues the UN summit couldn't deal with and delegated it to this open process. What happened at the IGF? This is just a sort of approximation, it's not a sort of numerical metric. The first 2 meetings completely, turned the question of internet governance into a taboo. There was no consensus on bringing it on the agenda at all. Athens, the first meeting, everybody was so afraid that this new process could fail that the program committee couldn't agree on addressing the issue at all. In the second year, the same. In the meeting in Rio, the program committee refused to assign any time slots to the question of who should govern the internet. But the host country, Brazil, addressed the issue. So they used the space, the time slots they had as host country to talk about this scandalous unfairness of the US still dominating the governance of internet resources. So it was addressed, but just because the host country put it on the agenda. And then things changed. In the meeting in Hyderabad and Sharm el-Sheikh, the people organizing this meeting had sort of developed some trust in the process, and they put it on the agenda. There are main sessions, they are 3 hours long, that has to do with translation services of the UN. And for the first time, they put it on the agenda. They asked a few people to sort of talk about how they had experienced the UN World Summit, how they read the declaration, how they interpreted the declaration, and these positions could be brought into one room and people were listening to each other. I still remember this today, and I still get pimples when I think about it. The atmosphere in the room, people were not shouting, they were listening to each other. And it was all transcribed, so people could read it afterwards. And the same happened again in Sharm el-Sheikh. People discussed the issue. The government of China said, you promised we would solve this in this forum, and it cannot be discussed. And we don't come to any solutions. Why is that? And other organizations responded. So there were 2 years when there were open, serious discussions, and one had the feeling there is some progress. And then something weird happened. It started in Vilnius. For some reason that I still find difficult to explain, the issue became ceremonialized. It wasn't taken seriously anymore. There was still, we put it on the agenda, we asked people with opposite opinions to speak up, and they did so, but it lost its authentic flavor. It became a routine, but there was nothing anymore where you had the feeling good that I'm in this room and listen. It just lost it. And the same was true for the following meetings. And in Bali in 2013, people didn't even put it on the agenda anymore. It became so boring discussing this issue, it simply didn't matter, and it died. The issue is still not solved, but this Internet Governance Forum was no longer able to sort of bring it on the agenda in a way that it mattered. What happened in between is something else, and that happened outside of the Internet Governance Forum. Following the Snowden revelations, the organizations who organize the internet infrastructure, all those who distribute internet addresses and run the registries for the domain name system, they met in Montevideo in November last year and issued a declaration where they said they are not any longer happy with the role of the US government in internet governance. They said something needs to change, we need to internationalize this. It was a very short statement, they couldn't even agree on a longer text. Very short statement. It ran around the world within a week. Everybody who has been involved in this, the jaws dropped. And people couldn't believe it, but it had happened not at the IGF, it happened outside of the IGF. And people wonder why that is. We've created this forum, it is in our hands, we can put things on the agenda, but it has become, in a way, toothless. So things are happening in this field, but it turns out the IGF is merely the venue where we can reflect on it, but where we cannot sort of come forward with new radical ideas that really change the political setting in this field. So, lessons learned. I think to create discussion spaces that are not in any way linked to action are powerless in the long run. When people just talk, but there is nothing that follows from this, when there are no recommendations, when it's not linked to anything that has practical consequences for the people attending, then it runs dry. That is one of my major insights. Multi-stakeholder dialogue has become a label that is very important in this field. Each organization operating in the field of internet governance today calls itself multi-stakeholder. It is an important label that seems to confer legitimacy, but below this label, anything seems to hollow out. So, what we see is that the Internet Governance Forum created a global audience for certain issues. People attend these meetings, but what happens is that it doesn't innovate itself any longer, because each group of stakeholders has a sort of veto power. They just need to threaten the others by saying, we won't attend any longer if you do A, B, C, D, E. And one of the issues indeed was the question of recommendations. More and more people said, we go home empty-handed. People from public administrations, they are used to coming home with a report where they say we made progress in the following area and we decided the following. They come never with anything back home from these meetings. So they start to complain in other groups too. But in this case, the private sector said, we stopped